Welcome to Digital Currents, brought to you by Morgan Creek Digital. I'm Xavier Segura. Each episode, we spotlight the topics and people changing the tech industry with a focus on AI, blockchain, chips, and big data. Thanks for listening, and please make sure to subscribe if you like what you hear. And remember, stay current.
Mark, happy Friday. How has this week treated you now that we were...
Aha! Happy Friday. So I can see how it's treated you, X. It's been a long one. And so a couple of things. One, we flip-flopped. So I have the blue with the yellow polo. You've got the yellow, bright yellow. I love it. Maize even with the blue.
Oh, yeah.
So we're flip-flopped today or inverse. You look like the yellow, by Bitcoin back there. It's too dang hot in North Carolina for long pants day. So no orange pants. And I don't have the orange swim trunks like last time, but I did bring some socks. So I have the Bitcoin whale and desert island. So the theme of, going to the islands makes sense when it's hot, but a couple whales surfaced this week. Coins that had literally not moved for 12 years.
Wow.
And a 2013 vintage coins in the range of $50 to $100 cost basis were liquidated. This is the interesting thing. Completely sold. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars. So that's interesting. So I thought that was the appropriate sock game today.
We could start labeling those like the barnyard or the attic finds, right? Where it's like everybody loves and fantasizes about, well, do I have a grandpa or an uncle that's got like an old Monet that's stacked away in the
That's right. 57 Corvette. Yep.
Right. The barnyard find crypto. That's what we all dream about. I think, we had a lot that's kind of happened in this run up. Mark, we cracked the 4 trillion mark for the first time on our markets, and I was, following the Genius Act. If folks haven't checked out that webinar, Market, I did a great one yesterday unpacking all of the latest regulations. So, that's kind of really summarizing where we are right now. And, you have not just this Bitcoin moment, Mark, that we mentioned, but also altcoins are finally having their moment. So as was theorized, that gap will narrow and rising tides will lift all boats, which is sort of what we hoped to find. But, with Bitcoin going to 123,000 last week, which is just wild, you had this kind of wave of optimism that kind of, continued to drive up the rest of the alts. And I think what is really interesting now is, where do we go from here? I love your nicknames, Mark, for the upcoming fall, where we got, Rectember and Uptober. Will we be looking at those? I'm not really clear about what's going to happen in August. I think July tends to be an up month historically. So, now that we kind of are really in those dog days of summer, how do you see us kind of closing out this summer session as we transition into the fall?
Look, summer, as you said, Tim Peterson has great charts on this, and he's been tweeting them out lately that, July is basically an up month. Mm-hmm. And it kind of makes some sense. It's historically a relatively positive month for many assets, partly because no one's around. Like literally everybody's off on vacation, and therefore the people who are at work actually can move markets a little easier than they otherwise could. And then you get the dog days of August, and then people come back to work. And historically, that's when the trouble starts, right? In traditional markets, September and October are historically not good if things are overvalued. Now, I think what's interesting for digital assets, particularly Bitcoin, and then we'll talk differently about, take ETH and so on to that point. So Bitcoin in the last month, up 8%. That's a nice move. Seems good. We broached new all-time highs at 123. We're down a little bit now. But 8% last month. Solana, 25% in the last month. So significantly bigger. ETH up 50% in the last month. So that, and there's some reasons behind that. Most of it's related to the Genius Act, which we talked about on the webinar yesterday. But look, the Genius Act is big because it basically codifies the rules for stablecoin engagement. And it basically says, hey, if you register with us and you play by the rules and you let us get our greedy little fingers in, then we'll let you be a regulated or registered stablecoin issuer. Oh, and by the way, you have to back it all with U.S. Treasuries because we don't have anyone else who will buy them. So that's all good. And most stablecoins are on ETH and Solana, so both of those make sense. But to the point, what's going to happen this fall? Normally, fall is a tough time for markets when they're overvalued. Well, what about digital assets? Are they undervalued or overvalued? Well, interestingly, Bitcoin is almost spot on its fair value, Metcalfe's law kind of value in that, 115, 120 range per coin. Okay, so if we're not overvalued, then we shouldn't have any downward pressure. I still believe the 4-year cycle exists. There's a whole bunch of people, including, some on our team who have made the case, and I don't think it's a bad case, that no, the cycle's been eradicated because there's now permanent demand. ETFs are permanent demand. Institutions are a permanent demand. The Bitcoin treasury companies are permanent demand. And that's all true, but it comes back to these guys. If the whales, if the original people who put a few $1,000 or, literally people who bought some drugs on Silk Road and they forgot they even had the Bitcoin, right? As I had the gift that gives on, the barn find, like literally people said, geez, I didn't even know I had these things. And that's not a lot of people, but it's more than zero. And the numbers are big. Like, remember, you could buy 2 pizzas for 10,000 Bitcoin. That's an amazing thought, right? There was a website you could sign up, and I think it gave you, I can't remember what it was. It was like 5 Bitcoin a week or something, just for logging in. So the numbers are pretty big. So there are some whales out there, and if they just decide, you know what, I need to go buy something, whatever that is, or, I'm just worried that, the government really is going to confiscate this, and this whole BlackRock conspiracy, or, they're trying to get all the coins so they can confiscate them. I don't know what's going to be the catalyst, but if there's still selling pressure, then I think things could change. But ultimately, I just think humans are going to human. And if we push the price way above fair value, then we'll have a correction. If we don't, right, if we just hover at 120, 125, 130, then there doesn't have to be a correction. And then we'll just kind of accrete at the level of fiat devaluation.
Well, we had a good point yesterday, Mark. Many good points from yesterday's webinar. Definitely, folks, make sure to check that out. We'll make it available. But the idea about, there are questions on how do I make money in X? Right? How do I make money in stablecoins? How do I make money in this market? I think we can talk about a signaling effect that as VCs, we look at for companies looking to make money in the form of an exit, an IPO or an acquisition. The big name companies in the space that have raised money for the last couple of years, they're all kind of now looking at this moment, because I think we look at things like regulation, we look at the price of crypto, the overall with a T trillion mark, which is just an astounding kind of number. And there are a couple of notable names that have now kind of raised their hands thinking about what this means, for them. And, one is BitGo, one is Gemini, which we had on the show pretty recently, and then the other is Grayscale. Figure is another, Bullish is another. So we have all of these kind of like legacy players, Mark, that when we were investing, back in Fund 3 in 21, these were the names, right? Like these were the hallowed names that were going to, carry the torch as far as, will incumbents lead this Web3 wave, or will the Web2 giants like, I don't know, a Google or an Amazon somehow get their act together, IBM, to incorporate, the Web3? I think it's very clear that it is the former and not the latter. The new kids on the block are going to become the incumbents, and all eyes are on this kind of IPO window because this year has been very good. I will tout our own horn on this show that we called 2025 the year of the IPO, which we were in this dearth. It resembles a little bit more like 2021. We had a good show on that. Is 2025 the new 2021? And the idea that in some ways, yes, in some ways, no, because we have this kind of new pattern emerge of quality over, some sort of boom and bust cycles, like SPACs, which were all the rage, which kind of drove up a lot of the value. So Mark, as we kind of look at, that kind of listener question of, well, how do I, make money in this market? Where there are a couple of ways, right? So obviously, the sign behind you is paramount, right? We have so many ways to do that now between, ETFs, treasury companies, logging into Coinbase, etc. Or Gemini, please support the local companies that we have in a portfolio, but then also the actual new technology companies. So we're getting to an age now, Mark, where the idea of how do I make money in this market is in my opinion, less about speculation and more about consumption. If we start consuming some of those products, like look at potentially a HELOC type of product that's originated through blockchain. We have other companies that now look at crypto or stable rails to perform transactions. So I think as consumer demand just looks for better experiences, lower costs, better security, this is naturally going to drive forth that. So the power of consumption, and then of course, looking at your Vanguard account or your Fidelity account for the newly listed IPOs.
No, look, there's so many important elements of that in the sense of, okay, making money, right? So, investors, they want to make money. Okay, well, how do you make money? Well, you invest, right? That's the key. Or you trade. And that means you have to have securities or tokens or things that you can participate in. So Solana or Ethereum. I mean, Ethereum is up a ton.
Oh, yeah.
In the last few months. Well, why? Well, it was languishing because there was concern around this idea of, well, if it was invented today, would anybody use it? What do you mean? Well, if it was invented today and it was slower and more expensive than Solana and Sui and Avalanche, would anybody develop on it? And the answer is probably no. Like, if the first thing is slow and clunky, like the original Model T Ford, it wasn't a very flashy car, but it was kind of the car. And then now we have, Lamborghinis and Ferraris and really flashy, expensive cars, and that's great. But if you had the flash of the Lamborghini and then you invented a Model T, not sure anybody would buy it. I'm just, I mean, at a low enough price point maybe, but the functionality had to be there. Well, in the last few months, people started buying Ethereum for a different reason. So a bunch of treasury companies sprung up, kind of, jumping on the bandwagon that the Bitcoin treasury companies had done and said, okay, well, we're going to be the MicroStrategy of Ethereum. And, SharpLink did it and, they bought a bunch of Bitcoin and it went up. And then there was this, Bitcoin immersion company that, was actually a Bitcoin mining company, right? They're a Bitcoin miner. And I don't know if Tom Lee convinced them or they convinced Tom Lee to become their spokesman. I'm not sure of the whole story.
Right.
But Tom Lee is a really significant influencer. And what I mean by not like a YouTuber, but he's on CNBC a lot, and he's got, a clientele of his research company, and he's an influencer, and people trust him because he's been right on a lot of stuff. So he said, we're doing this. And that company has gone ballistic, but more importantly, they've accumulated a couple billion with a B dollars of Bitcoin. But the funny one was, so you got all these people out there, and some are, putting in tokens in their MetaMask account or in their Phantom wallet or whatever, and you're buying NFTs or buying tokens, and that's speculating and trading. But then some of them also have a Robinhood account or an eToro account, good portfolio company.
Great.
And they're like, oh, well, I could invest in some of these companies. These are real companies doing real things. Well, is a treasury company a real company doing real things, or is it just acquiring an asset that we all love? It makes it easier and safer because as, industrial grade custody. Yeah, probably. So long story short, somebody came up yesterday and said, we're going to tokenize the shares of these Ethereum treasury companies. And someone said, well, wait a second. So you had an asset that was on chain that you could just go buy it on chain. And now you're putting that asset in a company and you're going to have a public stock. Well, now you're going to tokenize that public stock so you can put it back on chain. That seems like a lot of stuff to achieve the same thing. And so what it kind of does, it's interesting. If you think of why do we even have this show? Why do we even have a business that you and I are partners in? Well, it's because this, technology, blockchain, has the potential to liberate the $7 trillion of middle people, right? The leakage of financial services, the biggest industry in the world by far. I mean, there's nothing close. So it's the biggest industry. It's not the oldest, but it's the biggest industry in the world. And it's $7 trillion a year because there are a lot of middle people, right? There's your custodian bank, and then there's your trading company, and there's your brokerage firm, and there's your bank, which we learned yesterday that, RBC debanked the lawyer for the truckers, like out of the blue. So anyone who has RBC, debanked them because,
wow.
And the New York Times wrote the article, a bank account is not a right. Ugh. I mean, crazy stuff. So you got all these middle people. Well, if we're taking tokens and putting them in a wrapper in the equity market and then tokenizing that, oh, wait a minute. We're starting to look like the old TradFi, too many middle people, and that liberation of that $7 trillion of waste. I mean, it's not waste, but it's excess expense that we don't need because I can now be my own bank. If I own Bitcoin in cold storage, I don't need permission to get it. I don't need to explain what I'm going to spend. Like I went to the bank the other day to transfer some money to buy a piece of Pomp's new deal. And they're like, what are you buying? Like, it's none of your business. Like, well, you have to tell me. Like, no, I don't. I mean, I'll tell you I'm making an investment, and you can write that on your little KYC AML form. But no, I don't have to tell you what I'm. But it was just insulting.
Yeah.
So I need that bank account because most of the things that I have to pay money to won't take tokens yet. Eventually they will. So it's a long-winded way of saying we're in a transition period. And if you look at something where there's limited free float and there's suddenly increased demand, price is going to rise. So if you saw that, hey, these Bitcoin treasury companies were good, someone's probably going to do it for Ethereum. I should buy some Ethereum. Hey, someone's probably going to do it for Solana. I should buy some Solana. Hey, they're going to do it. I've heard now they're going to do it for BNB. Now BNB is already run, so maybe, you can't get in yet. But hey, they're going to do it for Ton. I don't know. Valuation of Ton's really, really high for, an app that a few people use. Probably more than a few people, but it's pretty high valuation.
So we're at a point now, Mark, where if we're looking at this moment, a couple of definite trends have emerged, right? Where it is certainly now the moment where if you are a successful Web3 company, you have had numerous conversations about what your exit means, in particular into this market. If you're seeing the rise of crypto companies being legitimized through, acts of Congress, you're also seeing the legitimacy in the price in terms of what the market is valuing. And then also, within treasury companies and other corporate strategies. Mark, there was just the release of, or the projection for what would be one of the largest new ETH companies that is set to go at, I believe, what is it? I think it's Dynamics Corp, right? Where the Ether Reserve expected to raise ETH machine, right? And it literally is a machine, Mark. It's expected to raise over 1.6 billion for 400,000 ETH. And so, this is the thing we always talk about with concentration makes you rich, diversification keeps you rich. So this idea that companies are going all in on different currencies, but as a consumer, as a participant in this overall market, we don't have to pick just one. I think that's one of the great things that this technology will sort of diffuse across the ecosystem. And if we look at it, what it means from an IPO standpoint and exits that we care about, you've seen in 2025, we are way out in front of the last couple of years in terms of IPOs. In 2024, we had 225 for the entire year. And as we sit now heading into August, we're already at 196. And not all IPOs are created equal, right? These that are coming are really kind of expected to be the big ones that could really tip the market. But maybe Mark,
look, there's been a long time coming, and there had been no activity for a long time, and good companies were kind of stymied in their ability to raise capital in the public markets, and that is all changing. There's always is that really a good thing? Insider selling is at record all-time highs. Corporate buybacks are at all-time highs. So wait a minute. Companies are buying the stock from their own employees. Jensen Huang said the other day, I've made more billionaires than any CEO in the world.
Wow.
It's probably true. It's probably true. The people that worked for NVIDIA, are more billionaires than Microsoft or others. But it's like, wait a second. If a company is using corporate money to buy the shares that insiders are selling, that seems dicey to me. Mm-hmm. But buybacks are a thing. They're hit all-time records in the U.S. this year, just hit all-time records in Europe, and now just hit all-time records in Japan. And so, which used to not be a thing, right? The Japanese were like, no, we don't do that. Well, now they're realizing financial engineering works. So it's a longer conversation, but ultimately, when we bring it all back to the tech, the Genius Act said stablecoins are here to stay. Now anyone who's been around knew that stablecoins were here to stay because it's just I've told the story, the first time I bought something sitting on my couch on a Sunday afternoon, it was instantaneous settlement. It was amazing using USDC. And that's way better than waiting for Monday for the bank to open at 9 or 9:30 and then going. And so just superior. So we knew it was here to stay, but now government, there's law, right? It got passed by the House and then by the Senate, and then President signed it, and it is a law. So now there is some nuance that the law has a lot of stuff about, we charge you to do this. So there's still some work to be done. But at the end of the day, Circle went from an $8 billion IPO to a $50 billion company today. It's pretty amazing for a company that, they make some money, but they don't make a lot of money. And the way the law is written, it's hugely beneficial for USDC and Circle and really negative against Tether.
Right.
Either Tether didn't lobby enough or Tether just said, hey, we got the rest of the world. We don't give a crap about the US, which is probably what they said. And, USDT is still the largest by a lot. I think it's 3.5 times larger than USDC.
Right.
And now they both pale in comparison to the total market. People are like, well, if Tether goes down, the whole industry. Tether's 165 billion. Mm-hmm. You just said 4 trillion if that 165 billion was a total fraud, which I'm not accusing it of being a total fraud, and I don't think it is a total fraud, but let's say it were a total fraud. It's not enough to sink a $4 billion industry. Now, would there be dislocations?
Or 4 trillion, even with a T, right? The capital.
4 trillion.
Right.
T.
Drop in the bucket.
Now, what's really crazy? So, Dan Tapiero, he's a buddy of ours and a collaborator, and we've co-invested things like Gemini. Dan named his company 10T for 10 trillion. So Dan and the other Dan Moorhead, and I were on a panel. I said I need to change my name to Dan to be a Bitcoiner. And we were on this panel at the Bitcoin conference a number of years ago, and they said, well, how big do you think the industry is going to be? And Dan famously said 10 trillion. And so 10T. Just this week, he rebranded to 50T.
All right. I love that.
Because he's like, no, I was wrong. 10 trillion, that's in the bag. This is going to be a $50 trillion industry. And it is, right? And I've talked about this, that Murray Stahl, who is the originator of this idea that digital assets, particularly Bitcoin, are going to absorb all of global money so that eventually we'd have a true Bitcoin standard. Shout out to Safety. And that number is 100 trillion. And so I would say he's the only guy that can make me seem bearish. Because I'm like, yeah, gold, when it was 10 trillion, half of gold, monetary value 5 trillion. I'm like, now the gold is 22 trillion. But again, about half of that is monetary, half of it is, relics, and, you can't trade that. But half of it is monetary value. So now we're at 11 trillion. That's in the bag. Like, super easy. That's going to happen. But to make the leap to 50 or 100, you got to assume a bunch of stuff. But I think it works. I think the math works. And that means buying and hodling is a strategy. Accumulating in a treasury company is a strategy. Diversifying into preferreds and converts and other ways to use the pristine collateral of Bitcoin as your backdrop for the future financial system, that all makes sense too. So I hate to say we're early. It's something that's, 15, 16 years old, but we're super early.
Yeah.
Not super early. We're early.
So maybe changing gears a little bit, Mark, and talking about AI. OpenAI is now preparing its launch of GPT-5 for next month in August. And I remember, Mark, once upon a time on this show that I had to convince you that OpenAI was worthy of a search relative to something like Google. And I think you weren't convinced until they made some software upgrades and changes. Yeah. I think right when they kind of moved over to, it was either GPT 3.5 or 4, when you started seeing that the searches were fresher, they were more topical, they didn't hallucinate as much, and they were...
When the hallucinations...
They still happen,
went down to a manageable level. I mean, they're still there. Mm-hmm. but it's significantly better. And look, if you go back to the original Transformer, it was illogical to think that that process would generate fact, because it's not searching for the fact and bringing you the fact.
Mm-hmm.
It's saying, based on all the information I've ingested, if I start a sentence with a word, what's the next word based on your prompt? So that's just calculating probabilities of words. And so the likelihood that it's going to say the right thing just wasn't very high. Now, is that good if you're writing a poem or writing a song, or you want something, just sure. But facts, there was a problem. Well, now it's incorporating this idea. Well, now we'll go out and we'll search and we'll look. And so we're trained. We're still calculating the probability of the next word, but now based on the data we're ingesting, we can have a higher likelihood of getting the right next word. And so, like I said, I tell the story. The first time I said, what's the Hesper Usico Scholars Program? And it was a program founded by Joan and Frank Usico. Like, who the hell? Well, that was Joan Kroc, Frank Eck, two other donors to Notre Dame, and it just conflated everything. Because, hey, those are Notre Dame people.
Yep.
Well, now it actually gets Mark and Stacy right. It still gets a bunch of the facts wrong about the program. So people have experienced this. In the old days, it was in the newspaper. Right? In the old days, you'd read something where you knew something about the story. And you'd say, oh, that's wrong, and that's wrong, and that's wrong. Then you'd go to the next column where you didn't know anything about it, and you read it, and you'd be, oh, that's interesting. You'd highlight it, and then you'd actually cut it out, and you'd send it around to other people in the office saying, hey, read this. Now we just, forward it without reading. Mm-hmm. And it's amazing because someone else was looking at that same thing going, well, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. So we have the same problem that we've always had, which is anyone who writes something, whether it's a human or an AI, there's errors.
Right.
There's going to be errors. And unless you physically pick up the thing that someone asked for, as long as there's any interpretation, right, there's the chance for errors. And it doesn't mean there will be so many errors that it's not useful. But the point is, I think the new ChatGPT is interesting. Although I got asked yesterday you're part of the I'm sure they did this to everybody, but you're part of the evaluation team for the new ChatGPT. Which one do you like better?
Yeah.
And I'm not exaggerating. On the left side, it put the big number first, because I asked it, what were the revenues of a certain company? It put a big estimate first and a small estimate second. On the right side, it put the small estimate first and the big estimate second. So that's there's no enhancement there. That's right. It's just, do you want me to feel like suspect of you? Because if you give me a big number, which I'm pretty sure is wrong, and it was wrong, because I actually talked to the company later in the day. This is crazy. So I asked, what were the revenues? And the estimates for ChatGPT were between 10 million on the high end and 3.5 million on the low end. Okay? Talk to the company, 325K.
So not in either range. And that wasn't the third option, Mark. It seems like there was just either you have the big one first or the little one second, not the actual correct.
But it was saying
number.
That, look, it's a private company, so we don't really know. So we're kind of estimating based on public.
Years.
And I'm like, if you don't know, say you don't know.
Yeah.
But to actually give me two numbers, look, if I'm a young analyst, and I go into ChatGPT and say, hey, tell me the revenues of X.
Yeah.
And I take that as gospel.
That's a very dangerous thing, Mark, when you're sitting across an IC table and you need maybe 3 or so points of critical information that you need to base a decision on. You need revenues, you need valuation, and you need, burn or runway. And if any one of those three numbers is wrong, you were going to be headed for disaster. But Mark,
it was,
yes, yeah.
it was, and the order of the order of magnitude was so wrong that I was actually kind of astonished. So look, we got a lot of work to, and it's better than it was. I mean, I did use it. I mean, you heard me read it. I did use it yesterday in our webinar about the Genius Act. I said, tell me the things that the law actually passed.
Yep.
And it actually gave me the 6 things that actually happened. Now, the details about it were dicey, but the actual factoids, the 6 things of, yes, we've standardized the definition of what is a permitted stablecoin issuer. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So you have to be permitted, and you don't have to actually be a U.S. bank. Like in order to be, do other things. Remember when Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley had to convert from investment banks to banks in order to get the bailouts from the Fed. So you don't have to be that, but you definitely have to be permitted. I'm like, okay, that's interesting. So it defines that. And so the tool is useful. But again, I think this comes back down to the whole argument we've talked about for over and over. AI actually isn't It's not intelligent, right? I'm not saying it's not good, and I'm not saying it's not useful, but intelligence is the ability to focus on something and ignore all the other extraneous information. Like, I'm talking to you. I'm hearing your words, but I'm not having to process all the stuff in the background,
Yes.
the guitars and the clock and all that stuff. A machine can't do that. It has to constantly process. And we've gone down the road of this. There are 2 problems. One is the amount of electricity and power that you need to generate these increasingly precise responses is exponential, right? Just the processing power, which is not the way your brain works. It's on low power. And the second is the valuation. So I think ChatGPT is a perfectly good tool now. Do I think the valuation of OpenAI is even remotely close to good? Hell to the no. Would I invest in this company? No. Now, people who invested 3 months ago will say, no, you're wrong. It's up a lot. Like, try to sell it.
So users, for the reminder, listeners, in terms of, some of the stats as we think about, is ChatGPT 5, the new model, going to really, be the step forward? The valuation, they raised $40 billion, Mark, back in March, and that valuation topped $300 billion. I remember not long ago, I can't remember the exact date in my mind, it's slipping right now, but Microsoft was valued at $300 billion, and it was one of, if not the biggest company in the world when it held that valuation. And so now we've got, a Microsoft invested product or project now. It's become this global leader. But as we look at kind of where it is, it's still losing money. There was a report that it was $5 billion in losses in 2024, which is an astounding kind of.
Of course,
these things are
all the things that I talk about that I use ChatGPT, I still don't pay.
Yeah,
I haven't paid 1 penny, not 1 penny. And every day I reach my limit. Actually, not every day. It used to be every day. Now, I guess they must have increased the limit of the number of searches you can do. But most days I hit my limit. I'm like, okay, fine. I won't use it anymore. I'll go use DeepSeek or Claude or whatever. So, because that's the other thing. We don't need 11 LLMs.
No.
We just don't. And do we need one? I don't know. Like, we used to have 21 search engines. Mm-hmm. Does anyone use anything other than Google? I mean, a couple people use DuckDuckGo, and a couple people, although it was funny. I don't know if you saw this. I don't know. It was I think it was Google. I think Google has something called incognito mode.
Yep.
That in theory, that meant they weren't tracking where you were going. And then they had to admit, yeah, we are. And yeah, we kept it. And so they were forced by a judge to delete. Now, did they really delete it, or is there a copy somewhere? I don't know. But the idea that it said you were incognito, it said that you were private, and you weren't. Well, how many other things are they telling us that aren't true? So,
yeah, and I think as we think about that, they were one of the quickest, if not the quickest, to hit 100 million in users. And since if we look at what that means for activity, they're sitting at 500 million weekly active users. So I think that this is going to be the threat to Google as far as how people are accessing information on the internet. And that's really kind of like the goal here is can they figure it out? But I guess as we maybe transition to the back half of our show, where we always remind the listeners, check us out on YouTube. I think the engagement there has been incredible. We can see if either one of us had been deep faked. That's going to be more and more important, especially if ChatGPT-5 has anything to say about it. Very crazy when you ask it to start to create pictures. They start looking like real people. Fun thing to do on the weekend, Mark.
I'll tell you what, though, the AI, because I do other podcasts as a guest, and a bunch of them have used AI to do a picture of me, and they're terrible. I mean, and look, I'm not a handsome guy to begin with, but they're horrible. And I'm like, guys, there are lots of pictures of me on the internet. Just take one,
right,
from anywhere, but don't use these. And a lot of them try to put me in a spacesuit, I guess, because we talk about rocket ships, but it's really kind of funny. Although, I've been playing Monster Hunter a lot lately, and the realism of Capcom generated figures, it's stunning. I mean, skin tones, beads of sweat. I mean, and there are other games that have the same thing, and it's all this real engine, these engines, that Epic Games was famous for. But AI still, and yes, there are new AI animators that are creating influencers and models that look pretty amazing. But I don't know. I still find pictures with, 6 fingers and, like that the torso turned the wrong way. So it isn't perfect yet, but it is certainly better. You're right.
Absolutely. In particular, if you give it this like prompts, the more prompts that you give it, and also pro tip for those that use the free ChatGPT. It's funny. My wife pays. My wife will pay for the ChatGPT version. I'm the person and the VC in house that has taught her how to use it, but I'm on the free one, so I'm not doing the community service. But if you can actually edit out the memories that we'll store in ChatGPT if you got to go into your settings, and that can customize your experience. So it's kind of like you're seeing your cookies in real time, which is, if you recall, in Google, that's the way that it can serve you ads or, give you different personalizations. ChatGPT works like that within its, module. So you can kind of change what it remembers about the things that you say. And I think that could
but that's so crazy because we did this experiment at an IC where, 6 of us put in the same prompt.
Right.
And we all got different results. Oh my God, there aren't 6 objective truths, right? And because each of us searched for different things, it personalized. And so I get why personalization is interesting to the companies. But man, when it comes to find me a fact or find me data, I don't want a version of the data based on what you think I like. I actually want the data.
Correct. So all this is to say that let's zoom out a little bit and think about the overall industry, right? So how do we get AI? We get them from chips. So, in the broadest possible sense, we have better chips, better AI. So what does this mean for individual countries and areas as it relates to those chip sales? And we can take a look at that in this chart of the week. I will share, Mark. Let me know when it is visible on your end. So this is zooming in. For those that are on audio only, we encourage you to check this out in the visual section. This shows at the end of last year, the global semiconductor sales by region in billions. And so I think this is a semi chart crime, but in a deliberate sense, right? Because what I see here, Mark, is that you've seen Americas, Europe, Japan, China, and Asia, APAC, all other, right? Which is interesting here in that, okay, great, USA, we're number one. That's where you want to be. However, APAC is actually 3 categories, right? So I think that is deliberate in that it kind of broke this out, because this is what we're talking about. This is why trade wars happen, Mark. This chart right here, the preceding 50 minutes that we were kind of setting up what is going on with Web3, which is heavily involved within chips, and more specifically what it means for AI and ChatGPT 5 rolling out. It is backboned by kind of these 4 main regions, and kind of why you have trade wars to begin with. It's over the scarce resource.
100%. Well, and it gets even a little more complicated in that domicile doesn't necessarily mean activity.
Yep.
Right? I mean, Halliburton picked up and moved their office to the Middle East, right? To Dubai. So is that a Dubai company, or is it a U.S. company that happened to move their headquarters to Dubai?
Right.
But actually, where do they get most of their revenue? Actually, from war-torn areas where they go in and get the special contract because they have government relations. So I don't know what should we count that as? And yes, America, particularly the U.S. and particularly NVIDIA, which is probably a huge portion of that dark blue.
Oh, definitely.
Is just NVIDIA. Well, NVIDIA is the designer, but TSMC, which is based in Taiwan, which is part of Asia, is actually the manufacturer. And I know TSMC is getting paid and NVIDIA is paying, and then they're reselling it. And so that's theirs, and they're getting paid for the innovation. But the actual chip is coming from Asia. And in many cases, it's heading back to Asia. And we just saw that, Jensen got the ban on H100 or 200, whichever one it was, sales to China reversed. So now he can go, sell all the chips. Not the top level ones, not the Blackwells, but the old ones that are being replaced. He can sell those. It's like selling your surplus, through Temu. But at the end of the day, China and Asia Pacific, which, obviously is including Taiwan, that is the center of the universe.
Bingo. Bingo.
For sure. And the other funny thing about that is, we talk about Taiwan as separate and independent, which they are. I mean, they're a separate country, but China doesn't view it that way. China views it as part of China. It's greater China. And so, people are like, we got to worry about China invading Taiwan. The leaders in China, and China's already ours. I mean, Taiwan's already ours. So why would we have to invade it if it's already ours? Now, it's probably more complicated than that, but I just think when it comes to chips, the manufacturing is critically important. And China, in the purple, has clearly said it's really important. And there's the book Chip Wars that we've talked about that, highlights this. But China has said, okay, all the big die levels, the 12s and the 18s, we're going to do that ourselves. So those big chips that you find in the back of your car doing all the sensor stuff, we're going to do that. The little chips, they require a lot of ASML, because that's basically the Europe piece is ASML, the machines. And the machines are really important because Taiwan Semi needs those to make the stuff for Global Foundry and Samsung, which is Korea. So that production of the smaller and smaller chips, we're going to let you guys do that. And then we'll just keep accumulating we'll go down from 18 to 12 to 10 to 7 to whatever. But we're going to let you guys mess with 2 and 3 nanometer. Well, okay, but none of that matters unless you have the design and the emulation and the simulation, which we have learned in the last few years is way harder. So again, I'm not minimizing how great NVIDIA is and how talented their engineers are and how amazing the process of engineering a chip that then works and scales. That is a miraculous feat. But it's still completely controlled, it's an interesting word, by Taiwan. Like if TSMC said to NVIDIA, no chips for you, right? What would NVIDIA do? They don't have any other option, right? They're not going to, they could try to go to another fab and that would take time. And so there is a really interesting dynamic there. And now TSMC is not dumb. Probably their largest customer. I don't know that for sure, but I'm guessing it is their largest customer.
Yeah, it's within the top 3 at a minimum. We could safely say.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's probably their number 1. But I would say it is a symbiotic relationship, and so there's not a power struggle in but it's in our best interest, which is why you saw the congressional delegates not going to China, but going to Taiwan, right? When Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan and a bunch of other people went to Taiwan, because they're like, hey, we need, if we're going to pass the CHIPS Act, which they did, and try to get innovation back in the U.S., which didn't really happen. Anyway, so it's a complicated story, but I love your point on the chart that America's clearly leader, and Silicon Valley, called Silicon Valley for a reason, right? It's all about the silicon. But Asia,
right,
broadly, and that's Korea, Taiwan, China, and Japan somewhat, although Japan has become more of a
more assembly. Yeah.
Assembly and production. And consumers. Like, I love my Nintendo Switch too. Like I waited in line like everybody else, and it is a miraculous product. I mean, it is beautifully crafted. But it relies on all the other guts from other countries.
Wonderful. Well, we'll have to cut it there, Mark. And I think it was a great showing that when we're seeing markets react to kind of the present tense, zooming out and seeing, what this is even all about from, the actual hardware kind of gives you some perspective. So, we will thank our listeners as always for tuning in here, and we'll always have to remind them to rate, review, and subscribe as they have been doing, and to stay current.
Thank you for joining us this week on Digital Currents. Check out our links to our website and social media in the show's description box. Please make sure to subscribe if you like what you hear. And remember, stay current.
This podcast should not be construed as investment advice nor solicitation for the sale of any security, advisory, or other service. Investment themes and ideas discussed may be owned by funds managed by the host and podcast guests. Any conflicts at the time of production have been mentioned by the host but are subject to change. Listeners should consult their personal financial advisors before making any investment decisions.